Hi, everybody. I'm Megan Cox from Reject Modernity, Embrace Tradition. On today's episode, we are going to be talking about book bans, and a lot of those bans involve allegations that books involve rape or sexual assault. So, we kind of need to talk about rape and sexual assault for that. If that's going to be hard for you to hear, this is a good episode for you to skip, and we will see you in the next one. Thank you so much for listening. Hello, everyone, and welcome to Reject Modernity, Embrace Tradition, where we take you back to the good old days, just maybe not quite how you think we should. I'm Megan Cox.
And I am Clayton Becker. And Megan, what are we going to talk about today?
Today, we are rejecting book bans and embracing parental involvement in education.
Rejecting book bans, but embracing parental involvement in education.
I know.
Those sounds like the same thing to me, but
you gotta stick with me. Stick with me for the next 45 minutes or so, and I will have you convinced.
I'll hear you out.
Thank you. Thank you very much. I appreciate that. So first of all, I want to ask you, Clayton, how much have you been following the story about book bans or other disputes over education in our country over the last few years?
Sort of like vaguely, I guess. I'm aware that they are happening. I'm aware that it has increased, right, in frequency.
It certainly feels that way, right?
Yeah, the books are coming under challenge. There were a bunch of clips that I saw on the internet of parents at school board meetings yelling at members of the Board of Education in various places. Certainly feels like parents are involved in education. So,
yes, it does. It does feel like some parents are involved in education. But I come with me on this journey, and I think that I will convince you that more involvement will fix this problem rather than less involvement.
Okay.
But first, let me take you through just a quick story, which I think is illustrative of the problem. This is one instance of attempted book bans in one community. So this story comes to us from last year, 2023, in the West Linn Wilsonville School District. Now, this is a school district in my community. I did not grow up in this district, but it's a couple of districts over from where I grew up. It's a suburb of Portland. So in this story, we have two women leading the community effort to have 8 books removed from libraries in the district. These two women, it should be noted, did not have children attending the district schools. One woman's children were no longer school-aged, and the other homeschooled her children. They and others that they organized to oppose the books contended that the values of the school district's leadership did not align with their own, that the books contained explicit content, and that requiring students to have parental permission to check out certain books was an insufficient safeguard because friends of students could and had, in at least one instance, requested the books and then lent them to children who were otherwise not able to check them out. When the news outlet reporting on the story, and I will cite my sources here, KGW is the local NBC affiliate in Portland. When the news outlet reported on the story described the American Association of School Librarians' response to the parents' concerns, that collection development is an intensive process and maintaining a diverse library contributes to both reading achievement and a welcoming school environment, the parents who opposed the books dismissed the librarians' contribution to the debate by saying that the organization did not seem to oppose any books and so was not representative of their community. So that's the no true Scotsman's fallacy in action right there. But the parents involved were not particularly interested in what the librarians or the school board had to say and viewed them as opponents in this.
Wait, so let me get this right. So the parents said that because the librarians did not oppose any books, that the librarians were not representative of the community.
Yes.
Okay.
Which really, as a reasonable extension, those parents could then say of other parents showing up at the meeting saying, I want my child to be able to access whatever they need to access. Those parents could have the same objection to those parents who argued against them, right?
I see. Yes.
You would think that. So it's logically inconsistent is my only point,
or
logically a little bit difficult.
Strange though that librarians would be pro books.
I know, right? It's very weird. But this is just one of dozens of stories about conflict over the availability of books in classrooms and school libraries over the last few years. At the time of the reporting, it didn't seem as though the 8 books they opposed had been removed from the district's libraries. Book bans are not new, but the scale and the content that is being objected to is somewhat novel.
Yeah, how like, it seems like it's increased a lot. Is yes. that just media, or is that real?
You would think it could be a media effect, but it is real in that actual bans increased 33% from 2021-22 to 22-23.
So just in 1 year, they increased.
In 1 year, they increased 33%. But then let me take you back in a 2-year jump from 2020 to 2022, attempted bans went from 273 to 2,571.
And that's nationwide?
Nationwide, according to PEN America.
So that's like nearly unfolded.
The American Library Association. Yeah, that's a massive jump, right?
That's crazy.
It seems so our instinct is it's gotten to be a much bigger thing. But yes, I also thought it was just media effects until I did the research for this. It's not. Organizations who track these sorts of things, I'm looking at PEN America and the American Library Association. They are saying that we are seeing more attempted book bans. So why, right? What's the follow-up question is is this real, is to ask why? Do you have any intuition on what you think is going on here?
I mean, it's sort of a cop-out, but it does feel like COVID, broke a lot of people's brains a little bit.
Broke some brains, maybe.
I can also think of like maybe the fact that students were at home so much during COVID, like parents noticed a lot more like what they were actually reading.
I think there's probably a possibility that is part of it. And we are definitely going to talk about all of those different reasons that I think this particular thing is happening right now. I do want to quickly address whether or not schools can do this in the first place.
Okay.
And what they are really allowed to ban. Because if you notice in many of these stories, schools are talking about banning, or parents are talking about banning things that are sexually explicit.
Mm-hmm.
Think about the Florida Don't Say Gay law. The issue was not, it was whether or not the ban extended to gay, lesbian, bisexual, transgender identity, but was initially about what was considered vulgar, obscene, inappropriate for particular children's ages. The Supreme Court in 1982 in Board of Education Island Trees Union Free School District versus Pico. That's a mouthful.
That's a long time.
Not pithy. Island Trees Union Free School District versus Pico held that students have a right to receive information, and schools could not ban books because of the ideas that they express, but that administrators could determine if material was inappropriate on the basis of vulgarity or obscenity.
Why? What's the distinction there? Like, why are schools allowed to? Because that seems like a pretty clear sort of like free expression sort of thing.
Mm-hmm.
Like, I know, for example, that there's like Fourth Amendment case law that's like schools are acting in this custodial role. They're like acting like, I think it's in loco parentis, right? Like that's the phrase that like the Fourth Amendment rights only sort of loosely apply to students because like the school is acting in the place of the parents.
There's a lot. There's a weird nest of case law around students in schools. You see cases like Tinker versus Des Moines, TLO, Acton v. Vernonia, which is another Oregon case. And in this particular case, you see that the Supreme Court in Island Trees, but also in predecessor cases, they are trying to ensure that there is not viewpoint discrimination for political content, for example, but that schools are able to enforce some sort of community standards when it comes to those specific issues of vulgarity or obscenity. And so that then becomes kind of a backdoor way of banning viewpoint or political content in the guise of obscenity.
Doing so, I see.
Or vulgarity. And I think the classic example, something that I just saw on the news, is another district trying to ban To Kill a Mockingbird.
Like one of the most challenged books in the history of humanity, surely.
Yes, yes. But usually it's people don't want the story of the racist white town,
right?
And the poor black man who is harmed by the justice system. In this case, the crux of the ban is the fact that, spoiler alert if you haven't read To Kill a Mockingbird, a book that's been out for like 70 years, the crux of the courtroom scenes, the dispute between the state and the defendant, is an alleged rape that it turns out the white victim fabricated, and the black defendant would not have been able to commit, given physical impediments that he has to performing those actions. And then he is convicted anyway, despite the fact that it would not have been possible for him to have committed that rape. The point of the story requires that part of the book, and families are now attempting to have that book removed on the basis of that depiction of rape.
So they're sort of like circumventing the viewpoint discrimination prohibition by going after something that isn't about someone's viewpoint, but is merely contained within the same work, even though what they're actually trying to do is ban the sort of racial depictions and the messages therein. Okay,
absolutely.
So
and the same sort of thing has happened with The Handmaid's Tale, which is another book that folks have tried to ban from schools and from libraries on the basis of its political viewpoint. But it also depicts rape a number of times. And again, critical to the story. The subjugation of women is the point in that story. And it is being objected to on the basis of that depiction as being obscene and inappropriate for students.
I see. That makes sense.
So it's kind of a subterfuge to get books with a certain political viewpoint out of school libraries under the guise of saying they are obscene, they are pornographic, and they are inappropriate for children of a certain age.
And it seems like this is happening basically with regards to conservatives not wanting people to be taught about things like LGBTQ identity or rights or the movement, and also with the last example of To Kill a Mockingbird, sort of the racialized history of things in the United States.
Absolutely. And specifically to that issue of LGBTQ identity, there is a strain of thought in some of these more conservative circles that the discussion of that identity is tantamount to obscenity because it requires discussion of sexual activity. I don't think that's true or based in fact, any more than the explanation of being straight requires an explanation like involving sexual activity.
You see people talking about this on the internet all the time of like, oh, students shouldn't know their teacher's sexual orientation, right? But like, nobody has a problem if like an elementary school teacher comes to school pregnant, right?
Yeah. Or the Berenstein Bears. Clearly, Mama and Papa Bear are straight and producing children. Like, that's just a very easy example. It is just that some people think that it is deviant, that is leading them to say, oh, this must be inappropriate. It's it's another sort of subterfuge. Now, I will say, that in that story, from the beginning of the episode at the Westland Wilsonville libraries, those parents declined to answer questions about whether or not they would support the inclusion of books that just represented LGBTQ identities. and that
Shocking.
is,
I'm shocked.
I know. They are saying, oh, these books in particular are obscene, but the natural extension of that argument is to say, well, do you think that all LGBTQ representation is obscene? And the response was, I don't think we have to answer that question. Which kind
How
of gives up
interesting. Yes.
the game a little bit. So what's really interesting about this whole thing, because yes, it seems like this is happening much more, and the data bears out that this is happening much more.
Like what's driving the actual increase?
So it seems as though coordination efforts are making it much easier for these bans to happen. I think of something kind of analogous to ALEC for state legislatures. You have a conservative organization that provides model bills. A 2023 investigation by USA Today found that community members across the country are using the same resources provided by an organization called which is loosely affiliated and disputedly affiliated with Moms for Liberty.
Oh, okay. Yes, I've heard of this. Yes. Okay.
Yes, which organized primarily women, but parents, regarding what was being taught in their schools.
So the idea is that like these parents might not even have read the books, that like no idea exactly what's in them. They just know that this organization tells them it's objectionable, and so then they go and object to it.
Absolutely. This is not a organic thing that is happening. The parent isn't looking over the kid's shoulder going, oh my God, what? Parents are going to a list and a grading scheme and saying, oh, this is an objectionable movie. It's almost as if you were to look at, oh, this is a dated reference. You were to look in the newspaper and see what movies were going to be playing in your local theater.
Yeah, I did that when I was 10 years old.
Yeah, exactly. Back in my day. And you were to see that your local theater was playing an R-rated movie, and you were to protest the theater to get that removed.
I see. So we might think of it as an extension of what other people have called the right-wing outrage machine.
Yes. Yes, indeed.
It manufactures this crisis in America's schools, even where one does not exist.
Yes. And an astute observer might notice that there is always a crisis in American schools. But certainly over the last few years, we've gone from mask mandates and vaccine requirements in schools to CRT, critical race theory, which is a university level concept that is not taught in elementary schools, to drag queens, teaching reading, to explicit books. So there's always something. And of course we ask ourselves cui bono, but there's always something. So why is this happening? There are many possible reasons, and I don't think anybody has one silver bullet reason, but there's a nest of reasons we might be experiencing this right now. Okay. And one of them certainly is the pandemic, I think.
Okay.
We've discussed this a little bit. But the pandemic gave parents a lot of exposure to education. The education that they were exposed to was not being conducted under ideal circumstances.
One might say poor circumstances, in fact.
Poor circumstances. So the expectation, I think, that you watching your child do school over Zoom at your kitchen table is equal to the teacher's best efforts to educate your child is probably an incorrect conclusion.
Yeah, probably not a valid assumption.
No. I think the pandemic also gave people significant issues with trust and control. In a broad way, it gave people a lot of fear, a lot of stress, and that's when we talk about, oh, the pandemic broke people's brains. Living in a constant state of stress and anxiety will limit your cognitive ability. We know this actually from research on poverty traps of all things in the comparative politics literature. We know that living in more poverty makes it harder for you to function cognitively.
Yeah, there's
because
like
the
there's an
poverty is creating
actual
stress.
cognitive burden of poverty. Yeah.
Yes.
I'm familiar with some of this work. There's like if I'm remembering correctly, one study of like farmers in India, right? And they sort of measured cognitive performance. I think it was like before and after the harvest.
That's exactly right. Yes.
Yeah. And like when they're worried about the harvest, when the harvest has not yet come in, when they're experiencing this anxiety and worry, they perform worse on these cognitive tasks than after the harvest has been successfully collected. If I'm remembering right, I think this is from that study that the cognitive burden of this kind of stress, this kind of poverty and anxiety, is roughly equivalent to having pulled an all-nighter.
Yes.
And imagine, think about how drained you feel after having pulled an all-nighter. Actually, I can't imagine that because I've never done it because I'm efficient with my time. But imagine,
I have.
imagine how awful it must be for those of you peons out there who have not had this opportunity to go to bed at a reasonable hour.
It's a really bad idea.
That's what being in this state of fear and anxiety is like every day. That's what it's like constantly.
That level of stress from the pandemic, I think, has impacted people's ability to think critically about the value of education being provided by teachers, and also their ability to regulate their emotions, because that's another cognitive function. I think you see that, there's so many videos of people losing their mind on airplanes, etc. That's the cognitive impact of the stress of the pandemic, I think. Additionally, the aspect of control. When you are under stress, when things feel uncertain, you try to expand your circle of control to as much as possible. And a child's education is one of the things that parents try to exert control over.
And it feels as though maybe a lot of this control is control that parents maybe ought not to be trying to exert control over. They should be involved, but they should not be trying to control things. Like, being a teacher is difficult. Like, you and I know this, right? Like, as educators.
It's hard. Yeah, absolutely. But there is a death of expertise in our country, or at least the value of expertise.
Yeah, people are tired of listening to experts.
Yes, exactly. And I think partially that is a response to the pandemic, when people thought that expert advice was changing very quickly. But also kind of an across the board trend over the past decades. Society more broadly has decreasing respect for experts. And many people don't view teaching as anything that requires expertise, honestly.
Like, you see people referring to teachers as like, well, why don't I just give them the babysitter's rate? Like, why don't I pay them $40 for the morning, $40 for the afternoon?
Okay. Well, does the babysitter have a master's degree? I guess is my question. Like, they're not doing nothing in those classes. You and I have taken classes on pedagogy, and we know that there are certain things that change your ability to actually imprint information on children at different developmental stages. You and I know how to teach 18-year-olds. We don't know how to teach 5-year-olds.
No idea. Absolutely none.
No, absolutely. It's a completely different approach. And the way you need to develop those building blocks are completely different. So the problem here and the disconnect here is that people who have not tried to do that don't necessarily know how difficult it is.
It feels a little bit like, and maybe some of our audience will be familiar with this image that made the rounds a couple of weeks ago about people saying like, oh, the government is wasteful because they're spending $45 a bolt, right?
Yes, exactly.
But it turns out that the bolt that was being shown in the image was like for an airplane wing, right?
Yes.
It's like, you might want to have strong, well-made bolts.
Very precise. This is a very precise thing. Actually, it's so funny. My brother is a machinist, and he does not want to do anything having to do with aerospace because it scares him. They pay more, but he says, I don't want to be responsible for that. But the disdain for the science of teaching or school library management, I think is a big contributing factor here. For the research on this episode, I looked up the qualifications you need to have to be a school librarian, and you need a master's in library science and a teaching certificate. What that teaching certificate is varies from state to state. But then I kind of thought, well, what do you even learn in a Master's of Library Science? So I looked up the course catalog for Masters of Library Science programs, and it includes public administration, which is like finance and law and government relations, marketing, technology, curation, media literacy, and how to teach media literacy to people, as well as specialization in things like early childhood education if you're going to be working in an elementary school.
So what I'm hearing is that it's a lot. It's a
It
lot.
is. It is.
Is this just for the state of Oregon, or is this like everywhere?
So requirements vary, but the MLS I was looking at was from Syracuse. So yeah, which apparently has one of the best programs in the country in library sciences. Now you know.
Now I know. If I ever change my career path and go to become a librarian.
But I think, the library and librarians, it seems like a black box. What could they possibly be doing? A lot. It turns out it's not a matter of, oh, I like this book. What's its Dewey Decimal Number? I'll smack it on the back of the book and put it on the shelf. That's not how this is working. But people don't know that. They don't know what's going into this. And just like that $45 bolt, if you don't understand why something is important, it is much easier to make fun of it or say that it is simple than to change your understanding or to learn more. So I will say that is probably one of the critical factors. Additionally, we have information filtering and the cognitive distortions that can create. So I think John Arnold, UCLA. Am I right? Is that filtering?
I'm not familiar with the name, unfortunately.
Okay. So we have the filtering idea, which describes how people receive political information. And as this information is taken in as it kind of conforms with somebody's prior beliefs or comes from a source that they already trust. And the more you know about a subject, the more robust your filtering is. And this helps explain why a parent might believe a media personality or a politician they trust when the politician tells them that schools are offering medical transitions for children, when they know that their child's teacher can't give them an aspirin without written permission from the parents. You would think that those two things would contrast in the parent's brain and they would trust themselves and their own experience, but that's not necessarily the case. They seem not to. And also parents might believe that their school is fine, but schools more generally are not.
Yeah, like none of the horrible stories ever happened to your school, but they happened to your cousin's, uncle's, sister's, brother's, nephew-in-law's roommate's kid in Susquehanna, wherever that is. New York? I don't know.
I think so. Pennsylvania, New York? I don't know.
Schenectady is in New York. We'll call it Schenectady.
You might believe that something like that is happening in a school that you're not connected to versus a school that you have direct experience with.
Right. And I guess this seems to bring it like right back to the crux of the episode, which is like maybe if parents were a little bit more involved with their own students' teachers, like knew them at a personal level, then maybe it would be a little bit they would be a little less crazy, for lack of better words.
Yes,
right?
Yeah. That is something that I am definitely offering as a solution here. I think that could create a real counter effect to these clear information issues, which are coming from an information environment that rewards that sensationalism and means that those outlier cases can get even greater effect or greater spread or greater attention. You also have media organizations and organizations like Moms for Liberty and that Book Looks website that we were talking about earlier that benefits from keeping people anxious about this particular issue. So they have a something to gain financially, attention-wise from keeping people worried about this issue. You also have effective polarization and the infiltration of partisanship in traditionally nonpartisan governmental entities like school boards. if people think that all teachers are blue-haired liberals, and that's not the values that I have and the values I want to teach my children, then they are going to be much more resistant to those individuals, just like the parents that we saw in that story about Westland Wilsonville, where they immediately othered the school officials and said, well, they're not part of this community. If you are starting from an assumption that people in this field or this role don't agree with you, that's difficult to overcome.
Yeah.
But we do know from the political science literature that it can be overcome through interaction with those people and learning about points of agreement.
Now, I imagine that that's what we're going to talk about in the back half of the podcast, but
yes,
I think
indeed.
it's probably about time for us to take a little bit of a break, and then we'll come back and we'll talk about, having talked about why book bans are ridiculous and maybe why they're happening, we'll talk a little bit about embracing parental involvement.
Absolutely. Sounds great.
Hello, everyone, and welcome back to Reject Modernity, Embrace Tradition. I'm still Clayton Becker.
And I'm still Megan Cox.
And when we left you, we were talking about sort of the basic ideas of how we might solve this problem. This one of the most actionable things we can do is sort of continue to rebuild this trust, this community, rebuild these interactions. So, Megan, what does that look like at sort of like a concrete level? Because it seems from the first half of the podcast that a lot of the problem is driven by parents sticking their noses where they maybe shouldn't be sticking them, right?
Yes.
How is what we propose different?
How this is different is we are going to broaden the number and nature of parents who are involved. And we are going to increase the frequency of contact. The conversations that we've been talking about between parents and schools, they are taking place in a very adversarial environment. And the parents have already decided that they don't necessarily trust the school officials, the teachers, the administrators, etc. But we know that repeated interaction with people you don't necessarily agree with, or learning more about people that you think you don't agree with, can be extremely helpful in bridging those divides. So I do want to tell a story about some parents that I happen to know and their experience with this particular issue, not on a book ban per se, but on the issue of what is appropriate sex ed for middle schoolers.
Seems
so
reasonably connected.
Yeah, right. Yeah. Something fairly similar. I have a couple of friends who their son goes to school in Washington State. He goes to middle school, and there is an administrative rule there that says schools must give parents access to inspect the sex education curriculum if they ask. And they did that. They were concerned with what their son was going to be learning as a 7th grader at the time. And neither of these people are particularly religious. One of them was a former police officer with a background investigating sex crimes against children. So he particularly knows that it's important that children learn about their body parts and about what is okay and what is not okay. And I give you this context because I think it's important to know that these are not people who are your usual suspects for people who would be concerned about sex ed in schools. They inspected the curriculum for their son's sex ed class, and went, oh, this is fine. This is totally what we would think would be appropriate. This is totally okay. All they needed was that opportunity to get more information, and they were back on board with what their school was doing.
So it's about bringing more of those people into the fold, as opposed to the people who are looking at BookLook's list of bannable books, and for lack of better terms, drowning out the naysayers.
That is what I would suggest, honestly. When parents are involved, trust is established and repaired, and teachers and administrators are part of the parents' perception of their community and not outside of it. Additionally, a lack of information can allow parents to fill this information vacuum. I'm sure that these friends of mine saw something on Facebook or something on the news or somewhere, got the idea that something inappropriate might be happening in their school. But when they had the accurate information from the school, were convinced that the school was behaving exactly as you would want the school to behave. So I have a couple of solutions for kind of trying to solve this problem, and exactly as you say, to sort of drown out the hecklers almost. Mm-hmm. We keep talking about the heckler's veto in American life, to sort of bring the normal back to parent-teacher interactions here. So I suggest as my first option, greater parental involvement in things that are actually helpful for a school. And I do want to separate this out and create a distinction here. As education has become more specialized, as teaching has become more of a science and more of something that you have to be trained in to do well, parental involvement has become more make work and makes life more complicated for all parents. Parents tend to complain about things like crazy hair days or 100th day of school parties or any of that. We didn't have any of that when I was in elementary school. I don't know about you. But bringing parents in for tasks that actually need to be done in a way that is accessible, useful, and requires no or minimal training creates benefits not only for the parent actually helping, who gets the experience of working with the students and understanding the school and knowing the teachers and administrators better, but it also creates benefits for peers of that parent as well. So how you might see this happening is if Chris down the street is helping with Reading Circle and you know and trust Chris, you may have a greater trust in the teacher and the school. And then Chris gets that experience of further interaction with the teacher, the other school personnel, building that trust through repeated interaction, like Putnam says that Chris would. On board? Sound good?
On board. Okay.
With you so far.
Okay. See, you would think, parental involvement. This is the kind that's actually helpful. I would like to note at this point, because the conceit of this show is that we should be returning to tradition. My grandmother, who was no longer working outside the home after she had children, volunteered as the school librarian at my mom's elementary school. And something you notice looking back to when boomers were children, or even back a few decades, you see much higher parental involvement in schools. Any number of studies will back up this intuition that parents are less involved in their children's school now. And the National Center for Education Statistics shows that the most frequently cited parent-driven reason for lack of involvement is a lack of time. And we've talked about that in our economic choice episode. We have talked about how people, because they feel like they have to hustle, they are not able to participate in other things that they might find more fulfilling, such as a child's school.
And it also seems to me that bringing parents in a way that like actually makes sense and like actually has them doing something worthwhile and valuable moves them away from this idea that like what's happening at the school is all a bunch of like horse shit, right? Like,
yeah, absolutely.
If I'm spending all my time helping dress my kid up for crazy hair day, I'm like, what are you doing at that school? Like,
what is the point of any of this? Yes, absolutely. That's just, this is dumb and a pain. And what is the actual value of this versus learning, helping students with some actual learning. I would add to that another issue often cited by schools when asked why parental involvement is falling, they note a lack of parental education. So the parents aren't being taught how to participate or how to assist the school or the students. Schools also note that there is a lack of time on the side of teachers or administrators who think that their other obligations prevent them from interacting with parents and that they lack training in how to successfully engage with parents. That definitely takes me to my next suggestion, which is to address that exact problem. I would also note, because I'm a lawyer and also I know this is going to be a response from anyone who has that sort of mind percolating in the background. It would make sense if schools were wary of inviting parents into the classroom as a matter of liability, but having parents complete background checks and work in pairs, I think, should mitigate some of these concerns.
Mm-hmm.
I think this should be a solvable problem and shouldn't be enough to stop schools that actually want to try to implement this. So the second suggestion that I would have to bring parents into their school communities in a way that will restore trust is to include parental guides to the curriculum. Schools should be providing a guide to parents on how to understand and support the pedagogy, including whatever evidence supports the particular teaching approach. Now, there's plenty of research on many pedagogical choices. I think you and I have looked at some of them together, about how to teach university level students. Research also exists at the younger level, but for some reason, there is a real gap between teachers and parents about how to appropriately teach children. Years ago, I was asked to do some research on a famous podcaster who I will not name for reasons of concerns about enraging his audience. He was running for Congress. That might narrow it down. It might not. And that research entailed reading a lot of his old tweets. And this is when Common Core was a flashpoint. I don't know if you remember this.
Yes.
A curriculum reform movement. And this person had a real problem with how his elementary age daughter was being taught math. He says, it seems more complicated, so it must be bad, according to this person. Now, having tried to change the policy of a governmental organization, I bet you this guy's daughter's school was not changing how they taught math willy-nilly for fun. There is probably some pedagogy behind it. And I propose that schools provide that justification for how they are teaching subjects to parents so that the parents can be helpful when their child is working on math homework or whatever, and understand it to support the aims of the teacher. Now, nothing's going to make someone read this if they don't really want to read this, but providing that information, the busybodies are going to.
Mm-hmm.
And those are who you care about. But you are hopefully going to get the involved parent who doesn't necessarily have a preset notion of what is good or bad about their child's education. Hopefully you are going to be impressed with the idea that the school is doing things intentionally and is doing things in an evidence-backed, research-backed way.
Yeah, there's actually a reason. There's a method to the madness, right?
Yes,
like,
yes.
Parents aren't just encountering things that they are unfamiliar with and thinking, oh, well, I'm unfamiliar with this and therefore it must be bad.
Must be bad. This is not how I learned long division, so this is clearly wrong. Yes.
I am on board. I'm on board.
Okay. All right. So solution 3 is the more combative of the 3 solutions.
Hey, you don't need to ask me twice, Megan. I'm ready to jump into the ring.
All right. Okay, we got you. Parents need to fight back against the folks who want to ban books. And I'm not suggesting violently. I am suggesting verbally. But something that I noticed in the research for this episode is that parents who have concerns about the curriculum like to act as if all parents share their concerns. Mm-hmm. That is, again, the no true Scotsman's fallacy. If you think that all books are fine, you're not a member of our community. And so your position is invalid.
Ooh, I'm gonna make a nice dated reference for you. It's like the town meeting in Field of Dreams, where the wife stands up and she talks about how beautiful the prose of the author that they're trying to ban is. There we go.
Okay.
Finally, I made the dated reference. There we go.
Good job. It's exactly. You have to be able to stand up in these meetings and take the side of saying that my parental rights and we could do a whole episode on how the concept of parental rights is not great and doesn't respect the autonomy of children, but my parental rights are to have my child have access to the books that you think are bad. And that's really the end of the story here. So
I think at this point, it might also be like worthwhile to note that like the people who show up at these types of meetings are the ones who are broadly speaking unrepresentative. Like there is a ton of research on this in political science about like who actually shows up to school board meetings, who actually shows up to the city council, who actually shows up to like zoning commission meetings, right? these people are like just demographically not representative of the community. They're more likely to be white. They're more likely to be wealthy. They're more likely to be, they're older. They're more likely to be homeowners. And they may, depends on the type of meeting, the research finds different things. They may also be more likely to be conservative, right? Than their communities at large, right? And having been to a number of these meetings, like not with regard to book bans or school stuff, but specifically with regard to housing, a lot of these people are just nuts, man. Like, they're nuts. Like, that's the only way I can think of to describe them. Like, they talk about like apartments going up a few blocks over as if they're like genuinely afraid of these buildings, right? Like, there's like genuine fear in their voice, right? And to go back to something that I said earlier, like, sometimes you gotta dilute the crazy with parents who are a little bit more normal, right? Like, these people probably aren't going to show up on their own. So you have to actively engage them. You have to actively involve them in the process. And I think that's maybe for me, at least, what I think I'm taking away from all three of these solutions is that schools, school districts, educators individually should maybe be a little bit more intentional about bringing the like normal parents into the process. And I guess like you might think that could be hard because all of the parents that you are like have experience interacting with are the crazies a little bit.
There's some selection bias there.
And so you don't want to involve any more of the parents, right? Like, it's not something you're interested in. You don't want to do it because you're like, well, I'm already dealing with all these people. Why would I bring in more people to yell at me?
Yes, absolutely.
But I think it's important to acknowledge and to think about, like, the parents who you want to engage with are probably the ones who are not likely to show up of their own volition, right?
Absolutely. I think that's absolutely true. You know, I think, and the folks who don't have those concerns and who are the diluters in this example, those are people who probably don't want to spend their Wednesday night going to a meeting where people who they perceive as at least not conflict averse, if not crazy, are yelling at each other about whether or not a certain book contains pornography. I think that it's difficult to get those people involved, and it is difficult as a person to want to put yourself in that position of standing up after someone has given a very impassioned speech about why a book should be banned and say, like, no, I don't think so, and I don't think you get to decide for me and my family. But that is what actually needs to happen. The parents who want to ensure that their children have access to information need to be participating, and those viewpoints need to be heard. We shouldn't be letting the worst loud opinion win.
Yeah. As we've talked about several times throughout our various episodes, we gotta get away from this addiction we have to the heckler's veto. We gotta get away from it. And I think I might add a solution 4 here, which is sort of connected to the first one in particular. But we need to provide additional spaces for these parents to be involved in a way that isn't directly combative, right? That isn't directly standing up, telling you after you gave this impassioned speech about how it's obscene and should be banned, no, actually, I don't want you to do that. We should also be providing more cooperative forums, I think, for parents to involve themselves in such a way that, like, educators and the school board and all of that, like, they are able to communicate these preferences in a way that doesn't necessarily make them feel as though they are being thrust into this confrontational arena.
I think that's a great idea to kind of create a more problem-solving orientation. A number of these articles that I read about different book ban attempts around the country, parents seem to be saying, we just want a committee where we can discuss whether or not this book or that book is appropriate and have some say. And were I not so concerned that committee would be composed entirely of people predisposed towards banning, I would think that that's a great idea. because when you get people to work together to solve a problem, you are going to have a less confrontational attitude towards it. This is something that you hear in like couples counseling. It's not you against them, it's you two against the problem. That's the sort of perspective that could be employed here. But you need almost a jury duty type system to get that to actually work, because if you have self-selection onto these committees, it's going to be, I don't think, a representative sample.
Yeah, what we call a lauderocracy, right?
Yes.
Where the members of the committee are just sort of chosen at random.
Mm-hmm.
Might be hard to implement, but we do it fine with juries, it seems, or maybe fine is a strong word.
Fine-ish.
Fine-ish with juries. So it seems like there might be a way to develop these sort of citizen advisory committees in a more representative way than oftentimes they currently get constructed.
I would hope so, but have I at least convinced you of the basic premise at this point that actually parental involvement in education might be a net positive?
Yes, I think I am on board with the basic vision, that the problem is not necessarily too much parental involvement, but not enough parental involvement among at least certain parents. Who
not enough diverse parental involvement.
Yes. I think that I am on board. And
outstanding.
I am on board. And I obviously fully on board with the idea that we should reject these book bans.
Fabulous. All right.
I am now,
then my work here is done.
I would say I am now also on board with embracing parental involvement in education. I think it makes sense. I think that the things that you've talked about that seem to be driving this increase in attempted book bans, and just the like sort of general craziness surrounding education these days, it does seem that they at least in part, you could argue, come back to the fact that parents are not involved enough with their schools, don't know enough about their kids' teachers, and so embracing more parental involvement seems like it would be a good idea. If not for every parent, then at least for some parents.
All right. Then my work here is done, Clayton. So I appreciate you coming along on this journey with me as we continue to reject modernity and embrace tradition.
All right. Thanks, Megan, as always. And we will see you guys next time.